this is a difficult and very responsible task. Therefore, I would like to convey the gratitude of the members of the Faculty of Science of the University of Ruhuna to Dr. K. Sunanda Kodikar, the chairperson of the organizing committee of Ristcon 2021, and his team for their creative, effective, and untiring efforts for making this conference a reality in hybrid mode. I wish all the presenters and participants a very productive and fruitful discussions on their findings during today's conference. Wish you all a very good and safe day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Your presence here is of much value to us. Next coming up item is a very special one on the agenda because it's now time for the speech by French Ambassador for Sri Lanka, Maldives, Mr. Eric Rivatut. Mr. Eric Rivatut, your views are really valuable to us. So it's my privilege to invite Mr. Eric Rivatut to share his constructive views and thoughts regarding the Ristcon 2021.
Mr. Chancellor, Mr. Chancellor, dear deans, dear professors and friends, it's of course a great pleasure that I have the honor to have been invited as a guest to participate in the inaugural session of the 8th RUNA International Science and Technology Conference, organized by the Faculty of Science of RUNA University. It is indeed in more ways than one that I am pleased to be here with you today. First of all, allow me to recall the lens of the relationship between France and your esteemed university. A major bilateral agronomic program was indeed carried out with the support of the French cooperation in the 80s. It was in this capacity that the University of Ruuna and then welcomed several French field assistants. It was at this time that some of the professors of this faculty were trained in France at the University of Montpellier, one of our main centers of excellence in the field of agronomy and agricultural science. During my participation last February at the International Symposium on Agriculture and Development, organized by the Faculty of Agriculture, I was able to see some of the equipment provided by France at that time, and with my great pleasure, some were still of used and of good help for the teacher, including some vehicles. Allow me also, and it's very important for all of us, to mention the memory of Professor Ru Nuewa, professor of Pali and Buddhism at the University of Ruuna, who died in June 2019. Professor Ru Nuewa, until his demise, assumed the function of president of the Alliance Française de Matara and Gaulle with full conviction. This was a great intellectual figure, and he has defended his doctoral thesis in France on the text of Japanese Buddhism and taught Sinhala and its literature at the School of Oriental Languages in Paris for nearly 3 years. Considered as a master by his students and a great sage by his peers, this exceptional figure had made an immense effort to develop our bilateral ties in southern Sri Lanka. And I'm very moved to think about this great figure of our cooperation and its wisdom that we share for, and unfortunately, too many. Finally, allow me to salute the active participation of the professor of the University of Ruuna in the current important project led by the Embassy and the French Institute of Pondicherry. This project on socio-ecological change and integrated management of the southeastern coastal zone from Ambatata to Batikaloa is mobilizing 70 scientists from the French Institute of Pondicherry. The project is strengthening the partnership with Ruuna University and 3 other local partners, Eastern University, Peradeniya University, and the International Center for Ethnic Studies. It covers the fields of ecology, sociology, economics, ethnology, and geography through the involvement of about 15 local scientists. It trains some 10 master students in the study of complex systems, interdisciplinary analysis, action research, and it promotes collaboration with NGOs working in the field of environment, sustainable development, and democratic governance. For Ruuna University, the overall objective of the proposed study is to assess the land to see dynamics of lateral transport of carbon in vegetated coastal habitats and to determine the influence of natural and anthropogenic processes affecting transport mechanism. So we are in the full science domain. The research project is elaborating spatial and temporal land cover change, modeling to characterize past and present ecological status of the selected vegetated coastal habitats. For this end, it is using satellite imagery obtained for 30 years period for the selected study sites. And some are very, very impressive to see the development and the change of the coastal part of the country, of this part of the country. The project will also assess the carbon stock of the coastal vegetative system in a mosaic vegetative structure, and it will determine flux of carbon transport through vectors of selected studies sites in Gaul and Ambatata. On the sidelines of the Ristcon conference, I would therefore have the pleasure of participating in an online seminar for all the Sri Lankan, French, and Indian participants in the important bilateral academic cooperation project. Sorry. Mr. Chancellor, when we met last year, I had suggested to you a series of projects that we could implement with your university. The sanitary situation, unfortunately, slowed down all these initiatives. However, believe that the French Embassy and my colleagues will remain ready when condition allows to strengthen our bilateral collaboration in a series of areas. I mentioned those of agronomy and multidisciplinary research. I will mention that of the establishment of the French teaching in Ruuna, as well as our availability to find possible interns who could be hosted on site in areas of mutual interest. In closing, allow me, Mr. Chancellor, dear deans, dear professor, and friends, to extend my best wishes for a fruitful debate and a successful Ristcon 2021 conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eric Levatu. Your presence here added a glamour to the conference. Next, to address the gathering, I respectfully invite our chief guest, Senior Professor Sujeev Amarasena, Vice Chancellor of University of Ruuna. Dear Vice Chancellor, sir, your immense support in organizing this conference made it a successful event. Thank you very much, sir.
Good morning to all of you. His Excellency Eric Lavertu, the Ambassador Ambassador of France for Sri Lanka and Maldives, Dean, Faculty of Science and all deans, members of the delegation of the French Embassy, Chairperson of the 8th Ristcon conference and the members of the organizing committee, senior professors and academics and colleagues. Let me thank the organizing committee and the Faculty of Science for inviting me to be the chief guest on this occasion. Let me also welcome a friend of University of Rona, a French ambassador, who had been here a few times, I think, including last year in Faculty of Agriculture, and supporting us in many endeavors, including research and development. I must say that during the pandemic and during the lockdown in somewhere in April, we started teaching French language. For our students, there is a French teaching language class conducted by one of our academics for 40 students, which is going on. And I must say, I accidentally found the person who was able to teach us French language within the academic community from Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. And I was planning to communicate that, but I believe it didn't happen. But maybe we could expand this language teaching. And I have actually focused that teaching for mostly the students in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, because that's where I think as a university we need to take the burden of making them graduates who are successfully able to get employed with time. So I think that's one of the target areas. And besides the fact that the University of Ruhuna is a university of the Silk Route. If you look at the Silk Route, our university is the unique university that's placed there along the Silk Route. So we are happy that we want to utilize that opportunity as much as possible for our own development and improvements in the future. And I'm sure not only me, my successors who will come over the next few decades will actually work on this theme and develop University of Ruhuna to become a very reputed international university along the Silk Route. And I believe France will be a friend of University of Ruhuna and Sri Lanka in that endeavor. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now focus a little bit on the theme Science and Technology for sustainable development. I think sustainability as a word we probably know in economic terms, in our own residences. We know how to sustain ourselves with a monthly salary and for years to come. So economic sustainability, I think most of us are fairly familiar on an individual basis. There are some of us, well, some of our unfortunate or maybe less concerned colleagues and staff members might not be in the same boat like us, but large majority of us probably would know what economic sustainability is. However, looking at the other two aspects of sustainability, the environmental sustainability and the social sustainability, are areas that I think Sri Lanka should be concerned about, thinking about, and perhaps developing new approaches to maintain or sustain itself. So I think in that exercise, this particular conference has good timing with an excellent theme. So at the moment world is struggling to sustain itself with a tiny virus. And this morning I learned that B117, the UK variant and the California variant, has merged together and produced a new variant of the this coronavirus to COVID-19. So the implications of that would be known only with time. It might not be as bad as we think. Oh, maybe the world has found an early answer in the form of vaccine. It looks like numbers and deaths are going down with the use of vaccine in some countries, but it's too early days to make any comments. But I believe the entire world has moved in a new direction to commence vaccination and perhaps immunize the entire populations vulnerable for the vaccine and try and get at least 80% of the population, world's population, vaccinated against COVID-19 to protect and perhaps sustain the world. We have been less concerned about environmental sustainability for good 50 years. I think we probably started learning about climate change in 70s, in the last century. But for the last 50 years, what he had done is probably not good enough. Now, we are at a juncture where the current generation is struggling to sustain its own needs while protecting the needs of the future generations of our children and so on. So that's the challenge to the sustainability. I think sustainability is all about that, all about the meeting the demands of current generation and protecting the needs of the future generations. In economic models within the families, we probably know this. But for environmental model and the social model, we have probably been less concerned, and maybe we should rethink about our own strategies. Certainly what His Excellency mentioned and our Dean Science mentioned about education and so on, everything becomes valid in that context. So thinking about having free oxygen, which some people are not able to get into their lungs and bodies due to a tiny virus today, despite being available free of charge, perhaps will become one day an environmental issue. It probably came from the environment through mutations of the genomes of the viruses and infected us from nowhere. So in the same way, clean water and safe food, the three essential things for our life. And then it becomes about clothing, the housing, the roads, and the needs of the modern lifestyles. So we need to strike a balance. And I think that we have known for good 2,500 years in this country, because our culture, our own religions, Buddhist philosophy and culture has taught this for 2,500 years. That's the sad part of it. That's a sad part. Scientists discovered it, that's important of climate change and about greenhouse gas emissions and so on and so forth during the last century. But without any of these things, we knew as part of our culture, as an inherited part of our religion, that we need to protect our own environment. And I'm sure all over the world they probably knew this before scientists discovered it. So it's all about, at the end of the day, attitudes, the behavior of mankind. At the end of the day, it boils down to that level to protect the world from destruction by eliminating all the possibilities available for sustainability of life on earth. So I think we have also a role as scientists and academics and intellectuals to promote this within a political culture itself. And we can, because we know that governments time to time in the entire world, not only Sri Lanka but maybe even US, can change their attitudes towards agreements depending on the economic needs. And we can see countries moving away from agreements on emissions, the gas and carbon dioxide, reduction in carbon-free environments, lots of things, issues like that, time to time, depending on their own needs, without any kind of control. And also, we can see natural disasters, say oil spillages in the Indian Ocean and many other oceans in the world, and destructions of coral reefs and lives all over the world, including Great Barrier Reef in Australia, where people are really fighting hard to protect and ensure its regrowth, are being challenged all over the world. So I think that's the role of our own academics and intellectuals. That I'm sure our keynote speaker, Mr. Daniel Gorman, will perhaps speak on this during his speech. Allowing the nature to regrow, to meet the needs of the future generations without compromising the needs of the current generations, or the other way, ensuring the sustainability of the current generations of the mankind without compromising the needs of the future generations, is the balance we need to strike in this sustainability model. I'm sure some of the research outcomes coming out in this particular conference will give some answers and perhaps suggest some models or answers to some of the problems we have today in maintaining the ecosystems in the world for sustainability. However, social sustainability, totally different game, perhaps depending on the perhaps more politically perhaps could be resolved more politically than with political solutions than many other solutions. But I think it also, all these three are interconnected: the social sustainability, economic sustainability, and the environmental sustainability. And I think that's where we have some 213 countries in the and territories in the world, of which I think more than 190 countries have conflicts. And that's social sustainability to me. Lack of the others, lack of or social sustainability, because I think one of the most beautiful things in the world to have is peace, and without peace we will not have social sustainability. And I think all of us have a responsibility, and an equal responsibility from all countries in the world, both from developed and the developing world, to contribute for peace on equal terms and on based on equity of every individual. And that's something that we really need to engage in social dialogue, because I do not think the entire world has actually found answers for that particular issue, social responsibility, and the right model to maintain social responsibility. And I think if we can do that, we will be able to, if we can develop those models for social sustainability and maintain economic and environmental sustainability based on science and research and technology that we are going to talk about today, we will be able to sustain land, biodiversity, and ecosystems for the future generations. That's for my children and your children and their grandchildren, and our grandchildren and their grandchildren. So that's all what it is about. Ladies and gentlemen, Chairperson, let me thank you once again for organizing this conference under extremely difficult conditions and hardships. And congratulate Faculty of Science and the organizing committee for doing that. And let me also thank and admire the courage all of you have had in participating in this event as physically as guests and members of the academic community, because that alone is a show of strength and courage to work on this theme and the model, the sustainability model. So let me thank the organizing committee for inviting me to be the chief guest today and wish this conference all success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Your presence here is of much value to us. Ladies and gentlemen, during this critical time period due to COVID-19 pandemic, we have decided to use eco-friendly adaptive feature. So as an alternative approach of distributing the conference proceedings among our all participants, including special guests, we are now distributing flash drives with Ristcon 2021 e-proceedings to our special guest. For that, I cordially invite Dr. Nishantha Kalutarage, Joint Secretary of the Ristcon 2021. Thank you, Dr. Nishantha. Now we are moving on to one of the most important items of the inaugural session, the keynote address. The rise of blue carbon science in Sri Lanka, conservation. Our keynote speaker today is Dr. Daniel Gorman, a research scientist at the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization. He is from University of Western Australia. To introduce the keynote speaker to the audience, now I cordially invite Dr. Sunanda Kodikara, Chairperson Ristcon 2021.
And thank you very much. First, I would greatly acknowledge the acceptance of the keynote speech by Dr. Daniel Gorman. Actually, Dr. Daniel Gorman is a research scientist. As I told you before, he is affiliated to Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Institution, that we call it as CIRO. And he's very actively working with many government institutions, including University of Ruhuna. He's a very good friend and a very good collaborator with the Faculty of Science. And the recent focus is on mangrove ecosystems and blue carbon ecosystems. And up to now, he has published more than 55 major works and having about 1,000 citations. And he has a very good experiences having held positions in Europe, Australia, and Brazil. At the same time, now he is working with us, with the University of Ruhuna, very actively as well. So therefore, I guess that we are lucky enough to have him on board, and we are going to have a great speech from him. So Dr. Daniel Gorman, I would like to invite you to have your great speech onwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sunanda. It's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Daniel Gorman from University of Western Australia to address the gathering via Zoom.
Good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, could I just check that you can hear me okay, please? Sorry, I was just having a few teething problems. Can you please confirm that you can hear me okay? Okay, sorry about those teething problems. I just wanted to confirm that you could hear properly because it was a little bit difficult to hear. Let me just rearrange my screen here. Okay. So, sorry about that. My name again is Dr. Daniel Gorman and I work in the Blue Carbon Hub of the CSIRO, which is based in Perth, Australia. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to come here and give the keynote address to the 8th Rahuna International Science and Technology Conference. To tell you the absolute truth, I was really looking forward to coming to Sri Lanka. I visited in 2019 and I really love the country. I love the people and I love some of the science that is a lot of universities and the government and a lot of people are very active in. I really wanted to come, but unfortunately the COVID pandemic, all of us are still getting used to life under the COVID, and I was unable to get a flight from Australia to come and visit you guys and be there in person. That said, I'm sure that we are all to some degree beginning to get used to life, whether we like it or not, online. And I'm sure that this won't have any influence on the amazing work and science and technology that we're going to hear about. It's also not going to hamper the fact that we can sort of meet together, form new collaborations and think about doing different works together. I'd like to thank the organising committee and the faculty and also the advisory board for doing what must have been a lot of work getting this workshop together. You switched from a fairly physical conference to an online one, and this must have been quite difficult, and you did very well to organise this in time. Before I get started, I'd just like to describe what you're seeing here on my first page. What this is a photo I took when I was in Sri Lanka in 2019. And what it does is it really summarises the passion and the interest that I have in science and technology in Sri Lanka. I was there with a group of scientists engaging in a number of workshops and other meetings, and we were lucky enough to be invited by the Forestry Department to go on a field trip up to Puttalam Lagoon. So we spent the day, it was a really fruitful and interesting and fun day essentially, and we spent the day talking with fellow researchers, some of the practitioners that are doing restoration ecology, and also local communities. And this was a very interesting and a great day. The day culminated in the photo that you see here. You can see people are very engaged. Some people are in the water getting muddy. You can see that they're taking photos, and there's a sense of enthusiasm and interest. And I guess this lies in the fact that everybody there felt that they were really doing something constructive and proactive. And by planting these mangrove trees, hopefully this is improving the health of the coastlines, and it's something that will remain for many generations. this is just an outline of the presentation that I'd love to give today. First of all, I'm going to describe to you what exactly are blue carbon ecosystems. I'd then like to talk a little bit about the multitude of ecosystem goods and services that they provide. I'll then talk a little bit about the threats, talk about conservation and the emerging field of restoration. I'd then like to focus my attention a little bit on the activities and the things that are going on in terms of blue carbon science in Sri Lanka. And then I'll give some final thoughts looking at the future challenges and actually trying to be optimistic about the future. Now, I know that the Ristcon series of conferences, they aim to be a multidisciplinary forum to discuss the fields of science and technology. And I guess that's my role here. So by introducing you to blue carbon ecosystems and sharing some of my passion, I hope to highlight potentially some of the innovations, concerns, and practical challenges that I guess are common to all of us, no matter what field of science and technology we work in. I think we often share common problems and maybe even common solutions. So this is very interesting. So just to start off and give a little bit of background of Sri Lanka in general, Sri Lanka is an island nation with a fairly interesting and challenging past. But a review of the economic and the scientific literature suggests that Sri Lanka is very much on the move. Sri Lanka emerged from a decades-long conflict, which must have been quite difficult and very hard to sort of emerge from. But Sri Lanka did this with exceptional agility and very well. So they actually, the island nation punched above its weight in terms of the entire Indian Ocean. It outcompetes in terms of economy many of the other nations around in the Indian Ocean. And the GDP grew to be worth more than $84 billion in 2019, which is quite impressive for a small nation. Thinking about science and technology, I did a quick review of some online databases, and I produced this figure that you can see here. So what it is, I tallied up all of the publications that had been published in Sri Lanka in a certain number of fields. The first one you can see there is the orange field, and that's all science and technology, minus medical, which I didn't include in here. And you can see that since the earliest times, the number of publications that Sri Lankans have produced, or collaborators with Sri Lankans have produced, has increased exponentially. This is quite impressive. When I focus down, and you can see here that the peak was more than 1,800 papers in a particular year of 1918. So this is very, very good. And I think per average of the number of scientists and practitioners you have, this is exceptional. By being interested in blue carbon systems, I also match this with the number of publications on blue carbon ecosystems. And this shows a very similar trend. You can see that it's a different scale, but Sri Lanka has produced more than 200 scientific papers on the systems that I'm going to talk to you about today. So this is very impressive. So now I get onto my passionate part and the thing that I've been working on for nearly 20 years, which is blue carbon ecosystems. And I guess to preface it, these are very important all around the world, especially in more tropical sort of equatorial areas. But it's particularly important in Sri Lanka because these systems are the systems that you see along nearly 1,340 kilometers of your coastline. They're also vitally important to support coastal fisheries. They support livelihoods, so the people that live along the coast, and they're also vitally important in terms of coastal protection. So what am I actually talking about? So I'm talking about systems that line the coasts, including mangrove forests, seagrass meadows, and tidal marsh. So I guess the term blue carbon is quite new. And when I first heard about it, I was like, if you look at those systems, they look more green than blue. But I guess the justification and the reason to call them blue carbon ecosystems is to distinguish them from terrestrial systems such as natural forests and I guess agriculture and plantations. The reason why is because they are very, very good at trapping carbon, hence the other part of their name. Because they tend to grow in these very silty and muddy areas, and because they tend to grow upwards, they trap a lot of carbon in their sediments. So this is very interesting, and this was the need to distinguish them from other ecosystems. when we think about blue carbon, it's also interesting just to think of the ecosystems that we don't include under this definition. Now, I'm not saying these aren't important. In fact, they're vitally important for many coasts, but they don't fit the definition. Some of these systems are coral reefs and bivalves. They do store carbon in the form of calcium carbonate, but through the process of this precipitation, they actually release, and the organisms themselves also respire. So it's much more complex. So these aren't included in the definition of blue carbon. The other one is kelps and macroalgae, and while they do sequester carbon and put it into their biomass, they tend to grow on rocky reefs or shaly areas. So they're not actually able to bury much carbon, and most of this carbon is dispersed away to other areas, and the fate of the carbon is unknown. So, okay, so now that I've clarified that, I hope, let's go back to blue carbon ecosystems and the distribution. So what we find when we look around the world is that these ecosystems often occur together, but they do have quite different or slightly different latitudinal distributions. Mangroves tend to occupy the tropical, subtropical through to temperate areas. You can see up in the top left-hand corner. So there tends to be a band of mangroves through this center part of the globe. Probably the absolute, the densest and the most species-rich areas of mangroves occur in the Indo-Pacific region around Indonesia, but the Indian Ocean also has quite an extensive distribution. The other powerhouse really is the Caribbean. Altogether, there's estimates that there is more than 181,000 square kilometers of mangroves. So this is important. The next ecosystem is seagrasses. These often occur with mangroves, but you can see here that the distribution is much, much wider latitudinally. So seagrasses in various forms are found from the high Arctic all the way through to the tropical. Recent estimates of the area of seagrass, which are problematic because it's harder to sort of see what's deep underwater, but the estimates are more than 250,000 square kilometers. So this is very, very impressive. The third one of our ecosystems, tidal marshes, they do occur with mangroves and seagrass, but they tend to be at more of the extreme latitudinal limits. These are probably cover the smallest area in total, and there's recent estimates of 55,000 square kilometers. One point to notice that compared to all the terrestrial land and the terrestrial sort of ecosystems, they do cover a relatively small area on a global scale, less than 2%, but they are vitally important for coastal environments and humans. So blue carbon ecosystems are being increasingly recognized as vital for the health and function of coastal zones, and it's important to understand them spatially. And this is particularly the case when they occur together, as they often do in Australia and also in Sri Lanka. They typically display marked intertidal zonation, and this relates to tidal level. So I took a picture here. This one down the bottom is a schematic of an intertidal gradient. And you can see that here subtidally, so below mean sea level and up to sort of high tide, is the domain of seagrasses. So they sort of live on this frontier, sort of closer to the ocean. That transitions through then to mangrove forests, which typically occupy the middle zone of the intertidal gradient. And then we move up towards the tidal marshes, which aren't inundated as frequently as the other two habitats, and they essentially mark the frontier between the marine and the terrestrial realms. To give a real life example, this was a Google Earth photo that I took from a place not too far from me here in Perth in Australia. And what it shows, this is a downward shot from Google Earth, and you can see that seagrasses, you can run a transit through from the subtidal through to the intertidal. There's an area of mud flat or sand flat here, which is often quite common. Then we move through to mangroves and up into the tidal marsh, which ends up in the coast. This is a useful way to have a look at these ecosystems, and it's the typical one, but I guess we need to be aware of the diversity of settings. All we have to do is think of places like the Sundarbans, which you're probably aware of, is an area of 10,000 square kilometers of mangroves, and an area close to where I am called Shark Bay, which has more than 1,000 square kilometers of seagrass. So while it's useful to think of these as linked ecosystems, there's obviously a diversity of settings. So just to sort of drill down and go to a higher resolution, let's have a little look at the ecology and the structure and the species dynamics, I guess, of these three ecosystems. And I'll start off with mangrove forests. So mangrove forests are a range of salt-tolerant trees and also shrubs that grow in intertidal areas in muddy or sandy substrates. There's often quite marked zonation within a forest as opposed to through the intertidal gradient. What we usually find, and this is also the case in Sri Lanka, is that you have more resilient and hardier species at the seaward zone, and these are often pioneering species such as Avicennia and Sonoraceae. As we move from the lower gradient here through to the middle of the forest, we end up with more mature and larger trees such as Rhizophora and Bruguera. They can reach very great heights in these areas, and the photo that I've got there actually is a photo that I took in Fiji of a Bruguera, and the circle there is just highlighting a colleague of mine. So you can see that these trees can get quite large. I'd say this one is at least 20 meters tall, so that's impressive. The second of our ecosystems is seagrass meadows. Now, these belong to a group of plants called monocotyledons, and these include grasses, lilies, and palms, the terrestrial relatives essentially, which is quite interesting because seagrasses actually did evolve on land and then they migrated or they moved back to the sea to become established there. They're true flowering plants, true plants in the fact that they have leaves, roots, and veins, and they produce obviously flowers and seeds for dispersal. They can form mixed or single species meadows in shallow bays, river mouths, lagoons, and creeks, so similar to where mangroves occur, but they need a degree of clearer water so the light can penetrate down and they can do photosynthesis. Again, with seagrasses, there's quite a diversity in morphologies. So we have some quite small and ephemeral species such as Holophila that come and go depending on environmental conditions. Then we move through in size and shape until we get to things like Thalassia and Anhalus, which are quite large and robust species that can last and be permanent for a long time. One of the things that is very interesting and very important about seagrass meadows is that they provide essential food, refuge, and nursery habitats for many fisheries. And this also includes a lot of endangered species such as dugongs and turtles. And I think Sri Lanka also shares, along with Australia, essentially our land is a refuge for species such as this dugong. This is a photo I took in Indonesia. Beautiful creatures, and I guess this just emphasizes the importance of seagrass meadows. The last ecosystem, just to have a look, is tidal marshes. So this is another large diversity of plants that include samphires, these more spongy or succulent species, and also grasses and sedges. Because they're regularly submerged, they have low oxygen soils and store a lot of carbon. Similar to the other ones, they provide essential food, refuge, and nursery habitat for many species. And there's a lot of literature coming out
Dr. Daniel Gorman, could you please unmute your mic? Could you please unmute your mic?
Hello, I'm just trying to. Let me just get the video back.
Yes, now we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get my Okay, sorry, I'll continue now if you can hear me okay. So just to focus in on some of those important ecosystem services, one of the most commonly discussed is the importance for fisheries production and human nutrition. And around the world, if we have a look at it, 10% of the world's population depends on fisheries for their livelihood, and 4.3 billion people are reliant on fisheries for the majority of their animal protein intake. Approximately 95% of all commercially important fish species depend on blue carbon ecosystems. And I guess this comes into the fact that they are very productive ecosystems, and they export and they generate and export a lot of organic material, which is utilized by countless species, like a huge diversity of species, many of which are prey species. And this is vitally important for the species that rely on these. To put it in a Sri Lankan context, fisheries production supports the livelihoods of more than 2.7 million people and contributes 70% of animal protein and subsidises 1.3% of the country's GDP. Another really important ecosystem service provided by Blue Carbon Ecosystems is that of coastline protection. And I know this is particularly relevant in Sri Lanka, given some of the things that have happened in the past, such as the 2004 tsunami. Mangroves, and also to a lesser extent, seagrasses and coral reefs, are able to dampen the wave energy to protect shorelines and infrastructure from surges, floods, cyclones, and again, tsunamis. And this really depends on the width of the forest, species, and canopy characteristics. You can see from these figures here, the top one is where you have intact mangrove forests, and also coral reefs, and the bottom is where they've been cut down or they've been cleared for some sort of reason. And you can see here that the wave height and the wave velocity that reaches through to the other side, where the humans and the infrastructure lies, is much, much decreased by having this three-dimensional structure. Some of the studies that were done following the 2004 tsunami in Indonesia suggest that areas that had a fringing coastline of mangroves fared much better with lower loss of life and reduced damage to buildings. And I guess this is not only interesting in terms of saving lives and reducing costs, but it's also likely to have implications in the future for the insurance industry. I guess now we move on to probably one of the other very well commented and very talked about benefits of blue carbon ecosystems, and it's that of carbon storage. So blue carbon ecosystems, they store a lot more carbon than terrestrial forests. This is a fairly commonly or widely shown metric here. So at the top, you can see the soil organic carbon and living biomass of terrestrial forests, so boreal and tropical forests. And you can see that mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrass meadows, they actually store per unit much, much greater amounts of carbon. And that's, as I mentioned before, because of the fact that they grow upwards, the high salinity anoxic conditions, which means that the carbon can't break down, and the high accretion rates mean that it can build up to many meters. This picture that I took here is a picture of a seagrass meadow, and you can see the living seagrass on the top there. And then you can see underneath, this is all dead and remnant carbon essentially, which has been stored. So you can see as this seagrass meadow sort of builds and grows up, it just traps and stores more and more carbon. And this carbon can stay there and remain inactive essentially for millennia. So how long can it actually stay there? So this was a pretty interesting article I found in Australia's ABC News. There was a farmer and he had a block of land, his farm, and he noticed this mangrove tree here. So he thought he'd go and get it tested and see how old it was. And it turns out that this mangrove tree had been on this property, or not on this property, it had been exactly where it was for more than 700 years. And it was termed the Magna Carta tree because it was about the same time as the document was written in England. And it really, I guess it just sort of shows how long lasting this carbon storage capacity is. And we need to think that the mangroves that we plant today could still be storing carbon in hundreds of years. And this is a benefit to our children and also generations to come. So despite the importance of blue carbon ecosystems, there's been a fairly strong pattern essentially of historical damage and loss and ongoing threats. So what this is here on this side is a panel that I took from a book chapter that I was involved in recently. And it's just showing you the main drivers of habitat loss, particularly mangroves, but it also bodes for salt marsh and seagrass as well. And these are the most common causes or threats that are ongoing. Probably the most commonly thought of is the conversion of coastal land. So is the conversion of coastal land for the purposes of agriculture, aquaculture, urban and industrial development. So you can see here there's been clearance of mangroves for shrimp ponds. Here there's increasing urbanization and the building of a city. Other factors that drive losses are changing hydrodynamics, such as water diversion and electric power, and also pollutants such as heavy metals and eutrophication from the release of sewage and agriculture. Other issues are also dumping of domestic wastes and plastic and things like this. And I noticed in Sri Lanka, you have some quite different ones. So a lot of salt marsh and mangrove areas are being degraded or lost by the improper building of culverts and roads. And there's also quite widespread grazing on salt marshes, which is causing damage to these ecosystems. If we look at it across the world, we can see that there has been huge losses, and in some areas this is continuing. So in terms of mangroves, mangroves are thought to be disappearing at a rate of 1% per year, with estimates suggesting that between 20 and 35% have been lost since the 1980s. The graph at the top there is showing you average global declines. And you can see here that there's quite a lot of mangrove loss through the Asia Pacific region, to some degree in the Indian Ocean. And I guess this correlates quite well with the level of development that's going on in these areas. Seagrasses have also suffered similar losses, disappearing at a rate of 110 kilometres per year since the 80s. And it's estimated that 29% of the areas have been lost since records began. And salt marsh areas are declining around the world, having lost between 25% and 50%. So I guess given this loss and thinking about it, what is being done to try and prevent this and to essentially restore the habitat that has been lost? And I guess governments and organisations all around the world are turning to the idea of ecological restoration. So it's interesting just to review what is the definition of ecological restoration. So a pretty good definition is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And so this doesn't include avoidance, which is vitally important. And this is your area of conservation and protection. This is definitely important. But what we're talking about here is rehabilitation and restoration. Now, the difference between these two concepts is rehabilitation means bringing a lost or degraded system back to exactly the same condition that it was, which may not be feasible or practical in some results. Restoration, on the other hand, is re-establishing the ecosystem services provided by these habitats, but not necessarily to the pre-existing condition. So an example would be if an area of mangrove was cleared for shrimp farming and there was a desire to restore this environment, if we were to try and rehabilitate it, we would have to bring back exactly the same conditions as it was when it was changed. Restoration, however, is to bring back the provision of the ecosystem services for the mangroves. So this might involve planting hardier or different assemblages of species that might be more suited to the conditions that have occurred, such as land degradation and things like this. So just to try and illustrate the idea of ecological restoration, this is another interesting story that I found really gives you the reason and the motivation behind this. So the picture that you see on the left is a farm in 2001, and you can see that it's been heavily degraded. There's hardly any vegetation on the hills there. It wouldn't provide a lot of ecosystem services. So I don't think it traps much of the sediments that run off there. So there's probably very bad erosion. It wouldn't support a high level of biodiversity, and it doesn't really look like a very nice place to live, to tell you the truth. The story was that a couple bought this degraded land, and over the course of 10 years, they planted 2.7 million trees with help from other people. And at the end of this period, you can see what they actually turned this farm into. So you can see that this is a much nicer place to live or visit. You can see that it probably provides a lot more ecosystem services. So all of these trees and this vegetation would stabilize the hill. I guess it's probably home for a huge diversity of species, and it probably also functions to filter and clean water. So this is just an example of from the terrestrial realm. Because of the success of these sort of terrestrial programs, there's also a lot of attention has been turned to trying to do this in the marine realm. And it's been recognized that nature-based solutions, such as marine ecological restoration, they have the potential to solve many of the issues such as climate, poverty, health, disaster, some of these issues that are called upon for drastic action by the Sustainable Development Goals. Two of the most primary ones for marine restoration are life below water and also enacting action on climate change. It's quite interesting, and I guess the recognition of the importance to do this has been acknowledged by the UN in their declaration of a decade of ecosystem restoration, which we're actually in now. This map here is just some work that I was doing, trying to tally up all of the afforestation and restoration activities that are happening in terms of mangrove forests. And you can see that these are really growing around the world, and it holds I guess the promise of trying to not win the war on global warming, but address certain aspects of this. This kind of work is driving a great deal of research to improve methods of restoration, develop finance instruments, and ensure that benefits are distributed equally to locals and communities. There's quite a bit of work, previous work, some of the attempts at restoration haven't been too successful. I think there was a very good paper from Sri Lanka that sort of suggested that a large proportion of the efforts in restoration do not actually work. But what we're actually seeing is this is slowly changing. The field is quite new, but I think we're rapidly developing a lot of the sort of technological know-how and understanding really how to upscale this. This is a recent paper that I was involved in talking about bright spots in coastal marine ecosystem restoration. And it shows really that methods are improving, and these are some pictures of the different ecosystems. It also includes kelp forests and corals. But you can see we're starting to get to the scale where we can restore tens up to thousands of hectares of habitat. So this is getting very good. This can also have major socioeconomic benefits, including job creation, enhanced fisheries, health, education, and tourism. So what about Sri Lanka? So Sri Lanka is very blessed, having a good representation of all three blue carbon ecosystems, sometimes occurring together, sometimes not. It ranks 15th in terms of mangrove distribution in the Indian Ocean and 9th in terms of seagrasses. And mangroves are the most well recognised of these, and there is a range of estimates from 157 up to 190 square kilometres across the different climatic zones, and you can see this on the map here. Seagrasses are also very important, but they're probably a typically understudied component in Sri Lanka. And some work is being done, and they're usually found in the northern areas around Jaffna and Trincomalee area is quite well known. While established estimates suggest about 240 kilometres square, recent estimates suggest that on a proper evaluation, we could be upwards of 2,900 kilometres. So this is definitely an area that requires further research. Tidal marshes are typically restricted to the north around Jaffna, where they may even rival mangroves in terms of area. And I saw a report here that there could be as much as 335 square kilometres. In terms of Sri Lanka is at the forefront of global mangrove conservation and restoration, and it's really leading the world in terms of many aspects of blue carbon ecosystem protection. It's the first country to protect all of its remaining mangroves. Sri Lanka is enacting many policy instruments to safeguard ecological health and human well-being, including the National Mangrove Policy, nationally determined contributions, and the creation of a mangrove task force. There's sustained research activity to better understand the distribution and ecology of ecosystems and the amount of carbon that these store. And one of the most exciting aspects is the identification of sites for restoration and application of best practice approaches. And I think Sri Lanka has committed to try and restore 10,000 hectares of mangroves. So just to have a look at what's happening individually. So in terms of mangrove ecosystems, there's ongoing studies looking at the floral diversity, including mangrove associates, plant growth, what determines that, looking at invasive species, organic matter production and uses and services. There's also quite a bit of work looking at the evaluation of faunal communities, and a recent study showed 248 species of vertebrate living in the mangroves, and this is a picture of a lizard sitting on the mangrove tree. Other work that I've mentioned is providing greater resolution in our understanding of carbon stocks from the three major climatic zones. So there was a recent paper here, Climate and Intertidal Zonation Drive Variability in the Carbon Stocks of Sri Lankan Mangroves. And I guess the key result of this was that depending on the climate zone and the environmental setting, mangrove forests can store upwards of nearly 1,500 megagrams of carbon per hectare, which is impressive even on a global scale. In terms of seagrass, growing research effort is now being focused to try and understand these habitats which haven't had a longer history of research. This includes field studies from important regions such as Puttalam, Jaffna and Trincomalee. Remote sensing is really taking off. There was some recent work that suggested a total area of 1,646 kilometres, and there's other studies that are focusing in other areas. Many studies are being done coordinated on the distribution, species composition, stocks, and the feasibility of seagrass farming for seagrasses. There's also work being done looking at the effect of light availability where algae overgrows seagrass, and this is particularly important where fertilizers and other nutrients are coming off the coastline. There's also the declaration of a number of national parks and reserves which aim to protect seagrass and the animals such as dugongs that live in them. Salt marsh is similar. There is studies of salt marsh being done in the northwestern region, the Mannar and Jaffna regions. There's shown to be over 9,000 hectares representing more than 22 species. Some of the worrying trends are that nearly 2,000 hectares of land has been earmarked for the construction of fish and shrimp farms. There's also ongoing cattle grazing in many of these areas. And I guess there's studies that are underway to try and better understand the effect of road and culvert construction, which can cut off tidal flow. I think one of the things that I've been actively working on with Sri Lankan partners, and I think one of the most exciting areas of research in blue carbon ecosystems, is what we're doing in terms of trying to restore abandoned shrimp ponds. So, and what these actually do is many of these shrimp ponds, I think there's 60% of shrimp ponds are lying abandoned at the moment because of white spot and other contamination. And these really, if we could transform these back into sort of coastal wetlands, this would be very, very important in terms of carbon sequestration and also the provision of those ecosystem services. The Forestry Department, in conjunction with other organisations, is currently working at 10 sites, 66 hectares, and they have accumulated, I don't know if these have gone into the ground yet, but they've accumulated more than 70,000 seedlings in nurseries ready to be planted. I guess the challenges here is we really need to try and understand and deal with the highly degraded nature of some of these systems. We need to try and work out or try to understand how we can restore soil chemistry and deal with factors such as eutrophication and pollution. I guess what we're doing at the moment is trying to best transition these into functioning ecosystems, and we need to use best practice approaches. So it's no good just going out there and planting thousands and thousands of mangrove if we don't actually think about where is the best place to put these. And if there's certain sort of hydrological considerations that we need to consider, this picture in the middle here is some fish bone structures which have been dug into a degraded area to try and facilitate greater success and the inundation of these mangroves. We need to do a lot more work to try and understand the best ways of doing this in Sri Lanka. Do we just rip open the walls and allow mangroves to naturally recruit, or do we actively plant species, and do we use multiple species? And we need to also think about the density. In terms of science in practice, I guess we really need to tailor our restoration activities to the area and the goals that we're trying to address. These need to be evidence-based, or we can waste resources. And I guess in these times of COVID uncertainty, we don't want to waste resources or money. It can also lead to negative perceptions by public and investors, which is a snowball effect, because if people aren't confident in investing in these kinds of programs, then it means we can do less. One thing that's coming out to be quite useful is using different life history stages, such as propagules versus seedlings, to target specific areas. And as the Vice Chancellor said at the beginning, doing all of these activities without the support of communities doesn't really work, because we need to sort of show and we need to demonstrate how enacting these kind of programs can create jobs, such as in the nursery, planting science, fisheries, and also ultimately ecotourism. Going on a little bit more about the social aspects of blue carbon science, we need to be able to demonstrate the alternative livelihoods that can be developed and grown and fostered, these things that don't result in the cutting down or the destruction of blue carbon ecosystems. We also need to make sure that we educate, and this is especially important of people that are involved in fishing and things like this, and also children. So the picture that I saw there was from the Mangrove Museum, which is in Sri Lanka, and I think it's the first of its kind in the world. And this is just pictures from children, and it really shows how highly they value these ecosystems. They're really bright, and they can see the value for fish and for humans. There's also the aspect of payment for ecosystem services. And we need to really push this idea of the blue economy, which is a sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth. I'm getting towards the end here, but I'd just like to mention a few of the challenges that I guess the whole world, including Sri Lanka, is going to face. COVID-19 lockdowns have affected research all over the world. I know for a fact that it's affected you guys in Sri Lanka. This has also meant that it's a lot harder to have meetings and to do field work. And we need to, I guess, like develop and fine tune ways of dealing with this. And I guess the conference that we're having now is an example of doing that online. There's going to be some economic effects on tourism. And in fact, the World Bank is looking at shifting the status of Sri Lanka. So this is likely to have some effects on research funding, which we need to consider. We also need to establish new partnerships and collaborations. And I guess this can be international, and we can try and foster these virtually and grow opportunities through the blue economy. And I guess the last thing is, how do we best adopt digital technologies that empower humans who are active in the fields of science and technology? So just to wrap up with a few conclusions, Sri Lanka's blue carbon ecosystems are vital to ensure a healthy coastal environment and the prosperity of the nation's people. Despite the significant challenges, research into the biology, ecology, and social aspects of mangroves, seagrass, and tidal marshes is increasing our current state of knowledge. Conservation is key, but so too is the emerging field of marine ecosystem restoration. And I guess we really need to highlight and promote and show these bright spots. We'll encourage more people to get on board and actually hopefully fund and scale up some of these programs. Ensuring the health of blue carbon ecosystems can create resilience and promote some of these nature-based solutions to these issues of poverty, health, employment, and coastal protection. And I guess to sum it all up, the future of blue carbon ecosystems is in the hands of humans, but technology and proper policy can ensure that they continue to play their important roles of ecosystem providers and the sentinels that mark the frontier between the land and the sea. So that's about it for me. Thank you very, very much. I'm sorry about the troubles in the middle of the presentation. I really wish you a fantastic conference. I hope that you make new friends and collaborators and can share some excellent science and technology. And I wish you all the best, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Daniel Gorman, for your inspiring and informative keynote address, which is of immense importance to Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, now it's time to present tokens of appreciation to Mr. Eric Livertu and Dr. Daniel Gorman. For that, I would like to invite Senior Professor Suchi Vamanasena, Vice Chancellor, University of Ruhuna. First, I cordially invite the Vice Chancellor to present the token of appreciation to French Ambassador, Mr. Eric Livertu. On behalf of Dr. Daniel Gorman, now we will present the token of appreciation to Dean, Faculty of Science, Professor P.A. Jayan. Very much, sir. Very much, sir. Very much, sir. Very much, sir. Very much, sir.
Ruhuna International Science and Technology Conference Secretary. Due to COVID-19 pandemic situation, Ristcon had been arranged as a hybrid conference for the first time. We organized the inaugural ceremony physically with a limited number of of invitees, while the technical sessions will be held virtually via Zoom. On behalf of the organizing committee, I take this opportunity to extend our heartiest vote of thanks to all who have supported to make this event a reality. The gracious presence of our chief guest, Professor Sujiva Amirasena, Vice Chancellor, University of Ruhuna, in this event, despite his extremely busy schedule, is a great honor to us. We'd like to express our sincere gratitude for the invaluable guidance and support extended to us while organizing this event. Thank you very much, sir. Next, we are extremely thankful to Professor E.P.S. Chandana, Deputy Vice Chancellor, University of Ruhuna, for his enormous support and guidance he has extended in this organization of this event. I'd like to take this opportunity to express our heartiest vote of thanks to Professor P.A. Jayanta, Dean, Faculty of Science, for his invaluable support, guidance, and encouragement at every point in time in the organization of this remarkable event. Thank you very much, sir. On behalf of the organizing committee, I'd like to extend our special thanks to Dr. Daniel Gorman for accepting our invitation and sharing important facts with this audience on the topic of the rise of blue carbon science in Sri Lanka, conservation, restoration, and resilience. We are also thankful to him for his generous support and guidance in organizing this event. We'd like to extend our sincere gratitude to Mr. Eric Livatu, French Ambassador for Sri Lanka and Maldives, for their collaboration with University of Ruhuna. Sir, we much appreciate your presence in this occasion. I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for our invited speaker, Professor Raghupati Kannan, who will share his experience and knowledge with the conference delegates at the plenary lecture this afternoon. I'd like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to all the members of the advisory committee and the members of the editorial board for their immense support and guidance in organizing this conference. I'd like to express our special thanks to all the internal and external reviewers. They paid a keen interest to support our conference by reviewing the abstracts and providing invaluable comments to improve the quality of the abstracts submitted to Ristcon 2021. I thank all authors and participants from various backgrounds. This conference would not have been a reality without your contribution. On behalf of the organizing committee, I wish to express my sincere thanks to all internal and external professors, academic staff members, and academic supportive staff members who accepted our invitation to participate in Ristcon technical sessions as panel members. We are grateful to FSPI Cedric Grant and all the sponsors of this event for the financial support provided. I may thank all academic staff members, academic supportive staff members, students, demonstrators, and non-academic staff members of the Faculty of Science for their invaluable support in organizing this event. I wish to thank the media team of the University of Ruhuna for their technical support provided. I also thank the maintenance, suppliers, and finance branch of the University of Ruhuna for their support in organizing this event. An event like this cannot happen overnight. It requires thorough planning and devotion. We have been fortunate enough to be backed by a team of very motivated and dedicated colleagues. I take this opportunity to extend my most sincere thanks to all the members of the organizing committee. I express my special thanks to all the distinguished guests present here accepting our invitation. I also wish to extend my sincere thanks to my colleague, Dr. M.K.S. Madhushika, for supporting us today as the announcer. Her gracious cooperation is much appreciated. Finally, I hope Ristcon 2021 will be a platform for scientists who join today to exchange scientific ideas, methodologies, applications, and expert knowledge. Thank you all once again, and we look forward to an extremely productive conference. I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hamid. We have now come to the end of the inauguration ceremony of Ristcon 2021. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise from your seats for the national anthem now. Thank you very much. The inauguration ceremony has now come to a close. So, ladies and gentlemen, please note that technical sessions will be started at 11 a.m. and you all can connect via Zoom. So, I cordially invite all conveners and co-hosts to be in line with this session. So, we hope you will enjoy the event. Have a great and productive day. Thank you very much.